I met a traveler from an antique land who said two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 12, Egypt. Before we leave Mesopotamia to set out on our new journey, I have to make a special point about Egyptian names and pronunciations. Now maybe you've seen The Mummy, and you got Brendan Fraser and The Rock, and they're all fighting, and you're like, oh my god, this is so cool, and then everyone starts speaking ancient Egyptian, and you're like, what? That's even cooler. Might have been just me, but either way, it's wrong. The speaking ancient Egyptian part, that is, Brendan Fraser and The Rock are awesome in anything they do. What I mean is that ancient Egyptian was written without vowels, so the only way people can try and speak it today is essentially with their best educated guess. It's not entirely a stab in the dark, however. Scholars and linguists have done an admirable job using a bunch of different sources. There's artifacts like the Rosetta Stone, translations from other ancient languages, and especially the Coptic script, which is used by modern Coptic Christians, which is in essence all that's left of the ancient tongue of Egypt. For us, this means that words are pronounced the way the academics say it should be pronounced. That means that the sun god, commonly spelled R-A and commonly pronounced Ra, is supposed to be spelled with an E and pronounced Re. Well, I'll do my best anyway. And the other thing here concerns the names of Egyptian people and places. Over the ages, they've been popularized in their Greek form: Heliopolis, Cheops, Ozymandias, and so on. There's been a real effort to break this habit, and for good reasons, of course. And whenever possible, you'll get the original name, but in the interest of not confusing people, if there's a really obscure place name or person, we won't use it. So instead of talking about, like, Waset, we'll just use the far more familiar Thebes. And now that that's squared away, it's time to head off to the dual lands of ancient Egypt. Herodotus, everyone's favorite historian/tabloid reporter, once remarked that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, and he couldn't have been more right. Go look at a satellite map of the modern country. What do you see? Winding down all that yellow desert is a vibrant stretch of green, all thanks to the rich black silt deposits of the Nile. In the old language, the land around the Nile is called Kemet, the Black Land. And on either side is harsh and unforgiving desert, the Red Land of Deshret. Now, unfortunately, we've just started, and we're already not calling things by their Egyptian name. The Nile comes from the Greek Nilos, or the Latin Nilus, although to the ancient Egyptians it was called Itiru, meaning simply the river. After all, what else is there? It's over 4,000 miles long, but for our purposes, we will be mostly focused on the last 750 or so miles of it. The river is relatively docile, and aside from 6 cataracts or whitewater rapids, trading ships could easily traverse the waters, bringing the riches of Africa downstream to Egypt. The origin of the Nile was hotly sought out in antiquity, although it wasn't until the late 19th century AD that Victorian-era British explorers discovered its true source: Lake Victoria. An impossible task, it seemed, had been completed. That is until 2006, when another team of explorers from New Zealand and the UK found that the river actually begins about 65 miles upstream from Lake Victoria in Rwanda at the Nyungwe Forest. It's not a huge difference, and not everyone is convinced, but it just goes to prove the allure and pull this river has had over the centuries. Even with modern GPS technology, we still don't know all about it. Well, what I can tell you at least is that when the summer rains come to the Ethiopian plateau, this water has to go somewhere, and it feeds into the Nile, sending floodwaters downstream all the way to a large delta at the Mediterranean. This annual flood is the real secret to the Egyptian civilization. As these waters breach the riverbanks, they pour out over the land. When it finally recedes, what's left is a layer of that rich black silt. a natural fertilizer ensuring consistent bumper crops year after year. That's not to say it wasn't clockwork perfect. The floods could be weak or heavy, called low or high Niles respectively, but generally it was manageable and arrived right on schedule, around June to September. This stands in contrast to the rivers of our friends the Sumerians. When the Tigris and Euphrates flooded, it could be swift, violent, and unpredictable. Once the floodwaters receded, the rivers might have even changed courses, and your city was now without a close water supply. The Sumerians had to dig extensive irrigation canals to cope with this, but all the Egyptians needed to do was simply dig basins near the river and let the Nile do all the work. As a modern footnote, with the completion of the Aswan Dam in 1970, the Nile no longer floods into Egypt. That ancient way of life, centered around a natural event for nearly 5,000 years, is now completely controlled by the dam, which can either prevent heavy flooding or release water during a drought. And yeah, when you think about it like that, that sounds pretty good, right? Sure, except farmers must now rely on modern chemical fertilizers for their crops instead of the natural and easy way, but progress. The annual miracle of the Nile granted an abundance of food stemming from relatively low effort. As such, the Egyptians had a near luxurious lifestyle as compared to the Mesopotamians. Unsurprisingly then, the Nile was a central focal point of their religion, with multiple gods associated with it. There's Hapi, a hermaphrodite god of the river's abundance following a flood, Wajwer, the pregnant god who represents the various lakes of the delta, and Nu, or Nun, an all-around primitive water god considered to be the father of all the gods. Nun also has a feminine aspect called Nunet, but do you see a pattern here? 3 male gods with female attributes. When you consider that the Nile is both a life-giver and a destroyer, it isn't too far of a stretch to see why the associated deities blurred the gender lines. So while the Sumerians were sweating it out digging up mud in their woolen skirts, the Egyptians were kicking back and wearing something a bit more trendy. Linen. Woven from flax, a perfect fabric for those hot and dry days. And whereas the Sumerians were still writing in clay, the Egyptians famously learned to harness the adhesive properties of the papyrus reed to produce the world's oldest paper-type writing material around 3000 BC. Hieroglyphs, the famous symbol-based writing system, come around after the Sumerians invent writing through cuneiform, although there isn't quite enough evidence to suggest a link between the two. Actually, though, if you ask the ancient Egyptians about the hieroglyphs, you'd hear the words Medu Netjer. Their script was literally the tongue of God. And this godliness is a wonderful thing, but even better than that is cleanliness. The Egyptians were early promoters of hygiene and grooming, not just the occasional scrub down, but a whole litany of methods to smell good and look good too. Manicures, pedicures, deodorants, shampoos, depilatories, exfoliants, moisturizers, and makeup were all known to the ancient Egyptians. And this wasn't just the province of the wealthy. Nearly everyone practiced some form of basic hygiene, although their methods might seem a little weird to us. Globs of scented fat were placed on a warmed headdress for a continuous source of perfume. Thick eyeliner was worn by women and men to not only ward off evil spirits, but also against the glare of the sun. And going as hairless as possible was the style for most of their long history. Pharaohs were expected to wear fake beards and a wig, but underneath it all they were intentionally as bald as a cue ball. And since Nair won't be invented for quite a while now, one recipe to get rid of all that hair goes like this. Take the paw of a female greyhound dog, the stone of a date, a donkey's hoof, and boil the ingredients in oil. Apply liberally, or if you're wealthy enough, it's far easier to just purchase some lion's fat and use that instead. Now, some might see this as your run-of-the-mill unnecessary vanity, not like modern society isn't doing practically the same thing, but truthfully, there's no better way to stay louse and bug-free than going hairless. It should also come as no surprise that the Egyptians were sticklers about washing their hands before and after a meal and brushing their teeth. And speaking of the food world, certain laws and religious edicts set what could or could not be consumed. Which for the common folk wasn't really an issue because their diet was already limited. However, for the priests and nobles, certain fish and meat were strictly taboo. Pork, for example, was forbidden to the priest class, but enjoyed as a luxury by mostly everyone else. Trichinosis, a parasite picked up from undercooked pork, has all but been eradicated from the modern farm-reared hog, but back then it was definitely a serious concern. Perhaps the priests knew that the risks of infection far outweighed the simple joys of some baby back ribs. Whatever the reason, this clean living earned them accolades from Herodotus as the healthiest people in the world. So maybe it was having all this success in the physical world that was the driving force behind the Egyptians' obsession with the world beyond. Whereas the Sumerians believed in a dark and scary afterlife, the Egyptians believed that paradise awaited, provided you could argue why you deserve it to Osiris, lord of the underworld. When an Egyptian died, the soul, or Ka, embarked on a journey to reach the fields of Aru, a land of total bliss. Before they could get there, they were judged by Osiris, Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, and 42 other gods. This is where one's heart would be weighed against that of a feather. If you led a wicked life, then your heart would be found heavier, and from a lake of fire would come forth Ammit, the Bone Eater. She whose body is half lion and half hippopotamus, with the head of a crocodile, she would swallow your heart, thus condemning your soul to a second death as you spend eternity forever wandering, forever without rest. But if you led a good life, knew the proper prayers, and was given a proper burial, then your heart would be lighter than a feather, and your soul would pass on to paradise. As stated in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, "Rise up, stand up, thou mighty one being strong. Sit thou with the gods. Do thou that which did Osiris in the great house in Anu. Thou hast received thy Sahu. Thy righteous soul shall not be fettered. Thy foot shall be in heaven, nor shalt thou be turned back upon the earth." Sweet deal, right? And if that's the afterlife you're after, then come on down to Crazy Ramesses' Mummy Mortuary for the very best in funerary care this side of the Nile. Following your untimely and tragic demise, we'll shave you hairless and wash you right up. Next, we take a big metal hook, delicately insert it through the nose, and scrape out your brains. Then our chief embalmer will make an incision in your abdomen on the left side, reach in and scoop out just about every vital organ. You don't need them anymore where you're going. Oh, but of course we leave the heart in. Osiris can't judge your soul without it. But guess what? We'll also leave in the kidneys for no extra charge. Now, because I can see you're a customer of discerning taste, we'll take those guts, wash them in natron, let them dry out, and stuff them into handcrafted, made just for you canopic jars. After we give your body a final rinse and cram it with our famous aromatic herbal blend, we add in more natron, sew you up, and let the whole thing marinate for about 30 days. Last, it's time to paint the skin with special oils and wrap you up in linen. And don't forget our Groupon, 20% off gold finger sheath and talismans. What a crazy bargain! But what do you expect from Crazy Ramesses' Mummy Mortuary? You might think I'm joking here, but this is a true account, if slightly exaggerated, of the top-of-the-line mummification process. And that's not including all the spells, prayers, sarcophagi, accessories, mausoleums, and all the rest that accompany the burial. Generally, when someone died, they were brought right over to the funeral home, for sanitary reasons, of course. However, if that person was a noblewoman, the law stated that the body must lay for 3 days before mummification could begin. Without refrigeration in the hot Egyptian sun, it's a pretty gross idea, but it was the only way to dissuade any embalmers from getting any certain ideas about getting too close with the client. Yeah. I bring up these death rituals because, well, they're interesting first off, but also because the Egyptians had a far different attitude towards life and death than other cultures. Take for instance that in the very oldest pre-dynastic days of Egypt, pharaohs who were too old or too weak to rule were said to have been ritually executed by his priests. The historical evidence for this is a bit spotty, although something must have happened, because this fully sanctioned regicide evolved into a symbolic ritual called the head sed, where a pharaoh would prove themselves capable to rule with an athletic contest. Well, that said, enough backstory, let's jump right into the histories. So ancient Egypt is split between the Black and Red lands, but it's further divided into Upper and Lower Egypt. This is a demarcation of ancient geography, not necessarily one of political subordination. Upper Egypt is the land in the south, near Nubia, and Lower Egypt is in the north, ending in the Mediterranean. Make sense? It will in a moment. Much like the Ubaid culture in pre-Sumer, pre-Egypt had the Badarian culture, a Neolithic people who inhabited Upper Egypt from around 5000 to 4000 BC. And just like before, that's not what they called themselves. The name comes from the El Badari region where their artifacts were found. But these people were just like other Neolithic groups, but seemed to take special interest towards a funeral tradition. Their dead were buried with possessions and carefully arranged on mats and animal skins. The earliest evidence of the Egyptian burial process? Archaeologists believe that the Badarians could very well be the ancestors of the Egyptians, as there is no evidence of a different ethnic group entering and mixing in until much later on. So from the Badarians come the Naqada culture around 4000 to 3000 BC. Here we see additional progress in pottery, metalwork, and stone skills. Trade missions are sent into Nubia, what's now Sudan, and Ethiopia. The former for gold, the latter for obsidian, perfect for razor-sharp blades and White Walkers. It's also during this time we see the invention of the world's oldest board game, Senet. Fans of the TV show Lost will recognize this, as it was featured as a metaphor for something or another. I guess chess was too cliché, but not purgatory? Anyway, no one's ever found a set of instructions, so historians have to do some hypothesizing as to how it's played. As the Naqada culture reaches that 3000 BC point, it now becomes known as the Proto-Dynastic period, where hieroglyphs develop into their more recognizable form, and the first necropolises, literally cities of the dead, are set up in places like Abydos, or Abju in their language. Not much is known about the detailed history of the ruling class here, although at least we have some names of those rulers from Lower Egypt. The Palermo stone, a chunk of black basalt, lists off a few of these folks, kind of like a less useful Sumerian king list. In Upper Egypt, the rulers are equally as mysterious, and chief amongst them is King Scorpion, whose name appears on an intricately detailed mace head. All that's known about him is that his name is just that, Scorpion. Yes, that's the Scorpion King Dwayne Johnson plays in the Mummy movies, but there's an excellent chance he wasn't actually part man and part scorpion. Following the Rock's rule, at some point comes a figure whom historians once believed to be legendary, but now accept his existence. The Greeks called him Menes, although he's better known as Narmer, the king who unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Narmer, whose royal insignia is of a chisel and catfish, is thought to have united the various kingdoms under his single leadership around 2950 BC. Almost 300 years before the earliest confirmed Sumerian king, Enmebaragese, for context. At this time in Egypt, the upper part was dominant over the lower. Being upstream and closer to Nubia meant it controlled all trade to and from Africa. Within this region, three kingdoms held the real power. Nekhen, later known as Hierakonpolis, Nubt, famous for its gold mines, and Tejeni, or Thinis, where our story begins. Narmer was a king there, and through military might and diplomatic finesse began his campaign of unification. He married the princess of Nubt, Naith-Otep, which formed an alliance there, and later formed the Thinite Confederacy, a coalition of tribal leaders, thus securing the land from the first cataract of the Nile, approximately modern Aswan, down to the delta. Maybe. Marrying Naith-Otep, yes. Confederacy, maybe not. This bit of history comes from the famous Egyptian historian Manetho, who lived during the 300s BC, so quite a gap in time there. But Narmer definitely united the Egyptians, and made a point of highlighting this in an artifact known as the Narmer Palette. This arrowhead or shield-shaped wedge of siltstone depicts two different scenes. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, a pointed hat with a curled extension in the middle. He's also shown accompanied by gods, animals, and the bodies of his decapitated victims. Fun! On the other side, there's a large image of Narmer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, which looks, at least to me, like a bowling pin. He's shown here grasping the hair of a captive in one hand and raising his mace in the other, presumably to smite his victim. A falcon representing Horus, son of Re and the favored deity of the pharaohs, watches on. By depicting himself wearing both crowns and having the favor of the gods, he's sending a bold message out. There's only one Egypt, I am all-powerful, and those who oppose me should tremble. Well, it worked. Narmer created a single state under a single ruler. And unlike the Sumerians, who we've just been bashing left and right here, The former Egyptian city-states did not operate as independent nations, but as cities, a novel concept. Narmer also establishes a new capital, later called Men-Nefer, better known as Memphis, and built a fortress on Elephantine Island, which effectively controlled all access to and from Nubia. He even established trade routes in the Levant, as pottery bearing his catfish insignia has been found there. Narmer might have even accomplished even greater feats if he had not perished so unfortunately. As Manetho recorded, he made a foreign expedition and won renown, but was carried off by a hippopotamus. Well, we can't all die gloriously on the battlefield, although to this very day the hippo is still the most dangerous animal in Africa, killing close to 3,000 people each year. That's almost twice the amount of global shark fatalities. And although he may have become Hippo Chow, Narmer's monarchy survives. Now, here comes another Sumerian comparison again. Their Lugals and Ensis weren't true kings, in the common sense, because political power was also shared with the temples and those early senates. Egypt, on the other hand, had a real monarchy, because the king was also an autocrat, one whose word was the only one which mattered. He was as sublime as wise Horus, and not just because he was a servant of the gods. He is a god. Well, an incarnation of Horus, to be precise. Although when your ruler is also the god you worship, how could he be anything but infallible? Wonderful as these god kings might be, they could be equally as severe. Popular culture has certainly made its mark promoting the image of pharaohs as slave drivers, gleefully whipping their own people into constructing stone monuments to their megalomania. While this is far more extreme than reality, it's not entirely without support either. The pharaohs were fond of symbolism in their portraits, and a common image is that of the humble lapwing, rekhet in their native tongue, which is a bird native to the area. On the King Scorpion macehead, lapwings are seen hanging from gallows, and later in the reign of King Djoser, a statue depicts him walking over a series of lapwings and bows. The bows represent foreign warriors, but the lapwings? In both cases, it refers to commoners, the regular people of Egypt. Hard to argue the intentions there, right? Everyone, even the king's own people, are not immune to his wrath. Also, if you're wondering why I keep bouncing back and forth from pharaoh to king, well, even though pharaoh will eventually become the official title, it won't formally occur until the reign of Thutmose III, around the 1450s BC. Pharaoh means great house, and originally referred just to the king's palace, but later became synonymous with the king himself, or herself, and the rest is history. Narmer's death ushers in the age of the First Dynasty, where we don't know much aside from the names of some of their rulers. There is one of note though, King Den, who combined the white and red crowns into one symbolic crown called the skent, and introduced the iconic Nemes headdress, the striped headcloth with a cobra in the middle called a uraeus. Egyptian rulers were quite fashionable, really, and had a choice between these 4 crowns depending on what image they wished to project. The First Dynasty ends with King Ka'ah around 2890, and, logically, the Second Dynasty is next, complete with little information and lots of kings with really hard-to-pronounce names. There's Hotep Sekemwe, Sekemeb Perem Ma'at, and the last king of the Second Dynasty, Khazekemwe. He's at least got some recorded info going on, reunifying the two Egypts after a civil war, and having a large royal tomb with gold treasure missed over by grave robbers. His death in the mid-2680s brought an end to this early dynastic period with the accession of his son to the throne, King Djoser. Egyptologists say we're now entering a 500-year period of time known as the Old Kingdom, and who am I to argue? So next time, let's talk about this Djoser fellow. You know, it's not enough for some folk. All the power, all the wealth, what good is it when the day known only to the gods arrives and you're buried beneath the earth? I doubt Utnapishtim knows where any more underwater de-aging plants are, so how's a king supposed to tell future generations how important he was? Irrigation canals are too pedestrian, temples are kinda ho-hum, and statues and steles are so boring. What's needed is a different kind of legacy, an indelible mark on the land that can withstand the ravages of nature and time. And something pointy, preferably pointy. We continue on with Djoser, the first of the pyramid builders, on the podcast history of our world.